Listen closely, because this story begins where certainty ends. A name trended. A clip spread faster than context. Screens filled with reactions before questions had time to form. For a brief moment, millions of people believed they had witnessed the end of a public figure's story. Then, just as quickly, the internet moved on. But what if the rush to accept closure was the real mistake? What if the most important evidence was never emotional, never visual, never designed to shock, but quietly embedded in sound? Tonight, we examine a viral claim that swept across social media, a rumor declaring that Charlie Kirk was dead, and the uncomfortable aftermath of how easily that claim took hold. This is not an assertion that he died. It is an investigation into how a narrative formed, how it spread, and why a scientist says the audio tied to that rumor raises questions about manipulation, staging, and the way truth gets packaged for mass consumption. This is about how quickly the world can be convinced of something that never happened, and how rarely we pause to ask how. The story begins with fragments, short clips, reposted videos, edited audio layered with urgency. In those early hours, people didn't verify, they reacted. Comment sections filled with grief, anger, certainty, and then came the silence. No clear source, no original footage, just repetition. That alone should have slowed things down, but it didn't. Because when a claim feels dramatic enough, it overrides caution. A scientist who specializes in audio analysis watched this unfold with growing concern, not because of the claim itself, but because of how the supporting material behaved. Audio, he explains, carries structure, it carries environment, it carries continuity, and when multiple clips claim to document the same moment, their sound should tell the same story. In this case, it didn't. As the scientist began comparing audio from different videos tied to the rumor, patterns failed to line up. Ambient noise shifted in ways that didn't make sense. Compression artifacts suggested different sources stitched together. Background sound that should have remained constant changed abruptly. These weren't dramatic errors, they were quiet inconsistencies, the kind most viewers would never notice, but that professionals are trained to hear. And once you notice them, you can't unhear them. This doesn't prove intent, it doesn't prove deception, but it does prove that something was assembled, not captured as a single continuous event. And that matters, because assembled narratives behave differently from real ones. Here's where the discomfort begins. If the rumor was false, and it was, then the real question isn't about Charlie Kirk at all. It's about us. Why were so many people ready to believe it? Why did the content spread faster than corrections? Why did platforms reward engagement before verification? This scientist points out something unsettling. Audio is often trusted more than visuals because it feels raw, immediate, harder to fake. Yet in this case, audio was the very tool used to give a false story weight. That should give us pause, because if sound can be manipulated convincingly enough to sell a death that never occurred, what else are we accepting without scrutiny? Some viewers fixated on visual details. Others asked about the scene described in the clips. Was there evidence? Was there confirmation? Was there documentation? Those questions were never fully addressed because the rumor didn't last long enough to demand answers. It burned hot, then vanished. And that may be the most troubling part. When false narratives collapse quickly, they escape accountability. No one explains how they started. No one examines who benefited. No one learns. The cycle resets, ready for the next shock. Media systems thrive on speed. Speed discourages reflection, and reflection is where truth usually lives. This isn't about accusing creators of malice, it's about recognizing a failure of restraint, a failure to slow down, a failure to ask, what if this isn't real, before hitting share. The scientist involved in this analysis isn't asking you to distrust everything you hear, he's asking you to listen better, to notice when audio feels emotionally engineered rather than naturally occurring, to question why certain elements repeat across unrelated clips, to ask who assembled the story you're reacting to. There's a moral weight to this. Real people are affected by false deaths, families, audiences, public trust. When we participate in spreading unverified claims, we become part of the mechanism that makes truth harder to recover later. And the guilt in this story doesn't belong to one person or one platform. It belongs to a system that rewards immediacy over accuracy, and to viewers who are rarely taught how to pause. So why revisit this now? Because rumors don't disappear, they evolve. The same techniques used here will be used again, with better tools and fewer tells. If we don't learn to recognize the fingerprints, especially in audio, we'll keep repeating the same mistake. This story isn't finished because the conditions that created it still exist. And the next time a name trends with urgency, the next time sound convinces you something is real before evidence does, you'll remember this moment. Stay with this channel if you care about how stories are constructed, not just how they feel. Subscribe for continued analysis, because truth doesn't demand belief, it survives examination. And the most dangerous stories aren't the ones that shock us, they're the ones we accept too quickly, then forget to question at all. What follows next is the part most people never see, because it happens after the attention fades, after the clips stop circulating, and after the certainty hardens into memory. And this is where responsibility quietly disappears. In the weeks that followed, the scientist continued listening, not because he expected to uncover a dramatic reversal, but because unanswered questions tend to echo, and audio, once examined, rarely stays silent. New uploads appeared from unrelated accounts, each claiming context, each presenting fragments as if they were whole. And yet the same technical irregularities persisted, the same unnatural transitions, the same mismatched environmental signatures that suggested assembly rather than documentation. None of this proved intent, but it did point to something more uncomfortable, a system where accuracy is optional as long as engagement is high. That realization forces a harder reflection, because if no one is held accountable for spreading something untrue at scale, then truth becomes fragile by design, and the burden quietly shifts to viewers who were never given the tools to evaluate what they were consuming. At that point, the scientist stopped focusing only on the clips and began examining the reaction itself, how outrage traveled faster than correction, how emotional certainty outpaced verification, and how silence followed once the claim collapsed, leaving no reckoning behind. This is where guilt enters the story, not as accusation, but as shared participation, because every like, every share, every comment amplified a narrative that never earned its authority, and once amplified, it didn't need evidence to survive, only momentum. Ask yourself why the correction never trended the way the claim did, why calm explanations never outperform urgency, and why platforms rarely reward restraint. These are not abstract questions, they shape what rises and what vanishes. The scientist describes this as a feedback loop, where creators are incentivized to be first, not careful, and audiences are trained to respond before they reflect. And once that habit sets in, even obvious inconsistencies are overlooked in favor of emotional alignment. That is how a false certainty can feel real enough to replace truth, even temporarily, and temporary belief is often all that's needed to do lasting damage. Somewhere in that gap, trust erodes, not just in media, but in the idea that facts matter more than feeling.
If this kind of analysis interests you, stay with us, because the implications extend far beyond one name or one rumor. As the scientist continued his work, he noticed something else, something quieter but more revealing. When people were shown the audio discrepancies without context, many acknowledged them immediately. But when the same information challenged a belief they had already expressed publicly, the resistance was instant. This isn't about intelligence, it's about identity. Once people attach themselves to a position, questioning it feels like self-betrayal, and that psychological barrier may be the strongest defense misinformation has. It thrives not on secrecy, but on pride. And that raises a troubling ethical question about content creation in the modern era. If creators know their audience is unlikely to reverse course even when shown evidence, what incentive is there to slow down? The answer is uncomfortable because it suggests that harm doesn't require bad intentions, only indifference to consequence. As this case continued to circulate in smaller circles away from the main platforms, the conversations became less emotional and more analytical. And yet, those spaces never reached the audience that mattered most, the ones who had already moved on with a false memory intact. That may be the most lasting impact of all. Not outrage, not fear, but quiet distortion. Stay tuned, because the next phase of this story isn't about what people believed, but about what they were never shown, and why the absence of follow-up has become a pattern rather than an exception. This documentary remains open because the system that allowed this to happen remains unchanged. And until that changes, the question won't be whether another false certainty spreads, but how quickly it does, and how many people will help it along before stopping to ask if they should have paused instead.